To our witnesses, apologies have been received from Oireachtas, George Lawler and Deputy Maurice Quinlivan. So this meeting is to discuss the issue of traveller identity, with particular reference to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the ICERD, and other related matters with TraVision. Our witnesses today are Mr. Bernard Sweeney, founder and director of the TraVision Foundation, Mr. Foley, archaeologist, and Professor Fergus Shanahan, microbiologist. You're all very welcome. And I'd ask anyone attending remotely to mute yourself when not contributing, so that we don't pick up on any background noise or feedback. And as usual, I would remind all those in attendance to ensure that mobile phones are on silent or switched off. As you are within the precincts of Leinster House, you are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the presentation that you make to the committee. This means that you have an absolute defence against any defamation action for anything you say at the meeting. However, you are expected not to abuse this privilege, and it is my duty as Cathaoirleach to ensure that this privilege is not abused. Therefore, if your statements are potentially defamatory in relation to an identifiable person or entity, you will be directed to discontinue your remarks. It is imperative that you comply with any such direction. Members are also reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person or entity outside of the Houses or an official of the Houses, either by name or in such a way to make him or her identifiable. I now invite Mr. Sweeney to make an opening statement, and then we'll proceed with questions and answers. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Thank you. Before I begin, I would want to acknowledge Senator Eileen Flynn, a fellow Irish traveller. She was first nominated to the Senate in June 2020 by Taoiseach Micheál Martin, and then went on to be elected by the people in her own right in 2025. She has represented her community with dignity and a space designed with travellers not in mind, and we are very proud of her. I also want to acknowledge this committee. You have consistently asked the difficult, necessary questions about outcomes on the ground, about implementation, and about where money goes. That shows us what we're talking about here today is not only a community concern, but something this committee has already recognised and has asked why the current system is failing. First, I would like to introduce Foley. He's an archaeologist. His research shows exactly how the architecture of colonial era and land management evolved directly into the modern policy. It provides material evidence that our exclusion is deliberate structural legacy and not a modern accident, even if it now operates at a subconscious level. Excuse me. Second, I would like to introduce Professor Fergus Shanahan, one of the world's leading clinical microbiologists. In partnership with Cork Visibility Group, his important work led to the groundbreaking discovery of a distinct traveller microbiome. His pioneering research demonstrates how forcing populations with non-industrial lifeways into settled environments fundamentally disrupts biology over generations, altering the microbiome and driving chronic inflammation. Unfortunately, Max Casey from the Tipperary Traveller Project sends her apologies that she could not be here today. And my name is Bernard Sweeney. I am the Director of TraVision Foundation, and we work across healing, decolonisation, de-traumatisation, bringing together history, archaeology, trauma science, psychology and biological research into a single framework using arts-based approach. And I'm currently engaged with a number of projects, including mental health, science, and hopefully later this year giving our presentation to the United Nations. Chair, what we're presenting today is a fundamental shift in perspective and a change in paradigm based on objective truth. If the current framing of a problem is incomplete, then even a great deal of hard work can still produce harmful outcomes. It's like teaching the wrong lessons and expecting people to come up with the right outcomes, or the wrong diagnosis is made and the best medicine in the world will not help. We are here to suggest that the issues affecting travellers today, such as land rights, legal and political representation, and health inequalities, are not just administrative failures, but they are ongoing colonial issues. When the state came into being in 1922, the legal administration structures already in place remained largely intact. For the majority of the settled Irish population, political change brought a new national framework, but for travellers, the systems of governing land, mobility and institutional control changed very little to date. In areas affecting habitation, surveillance and legitimacy, the old assumptions persisted. We continue to live under the architecture of a colonial framework, and many of these laws and policies still affecting travellers today can be traced directly to those colonial origins. Because Ireland was the first laboratory for England and the blueprint for Western colonialism, the methods used to restrict mobility and control here were later exported globally. This gives this state and this committee a unique moral opportunity to be the place where these inherent systems can be finally understood and potentially a benefit to a global population. We say this not to be controversial, but to finally understand the root cause, and we feel Dublin is now ready for this. To see this clearly, we only need to look at the state's own baseline of internal colonialism, the report of the Commission on Itinerancy, launched on the 8th of August of 1963. Even with its limitations, at that time travellers were living in physically difficult conditions as much as the country was, yet the report itself does not describe a psychologically broken people. On the contrary, it records that traveller children were no less intelligent than the average child in a settled community and no less apt than other children. It also states that travellers did not consider themselves inferior to the settled population and had no discernible inferior complex. When the initial barrier was overcome, the Commission described many travellers as intelligent, frank, cheerful and engaging. In relation to the crime, the report states plainly that itinerance as a body did not constitute a criminal element in the population and had no predisposition to crime. It also acknowledged that travellers were often blamed for more crimes than they committed and for crimes seldom committed. Compare that to the present day. We have a greater infrastructure, consultation, with statutory engagement. The state frequently uses the language of inclusion, and yet the outcomes are devastatingly worse. Life expectancy remains severely reduced. Chronic health inequalities persist. Travellers remain overrepresented in the prison system, overrepresented in the graveyards, underrepresented in political life, and too often failed by the education system. Exclusion from land continues and land rights remain unresolved. And the most tragically of it all, our children and young people are dying by suicide. So let us be clear, there can be no celebration of progress when our children are in the graveyard. The proof of this inherent system is colonial, is not just in the history books, it's in those graveyards. The General Statistics Office figures show the average age of death in 2023 was 58.5 years old for Irish travellers, compared to 78.6 years old for the settled Irish. That's missing a generation. For the past 60 years, much of the institutional understanding of travellers' life has been brought through sociology, social policy and service delivery models. That work documented disadvantage, counted exclusion and described crisis, but on its own it was not enough. It did not fully explain the long-term effects of colonial governments. When one discipline dominates, it narrows the field of vision, and when the field of vision narrows, the solutions narrow with it. Travellers are often described as being researched to death. What that usually means in practice is repeated deficit-based, trauma-heavy research focused on depression, anxiety, psychological distress, suicide, exclusion, discrimination, and social difficulties, usually explained entirely through a social and social service delivery lens. How much of that work documents much of that work documents crisis over and over again, but asks far less often what protects traveller life, what strengths exist within the community, and what community has survived, what our biology tells us, what the resilience might look like across generations. Too often the same problems are studied again and again in the same way, and that starts to pass for the whole story. This is why a multidisciplinary approach is essential. We need various disciplines such as science, history, archaeology, microbiology. Fergus Shanahan's work suggests that forcing population with older non-industrial lifeways into settled environments alters biology over generations. It disrupts immune regulation, implementation, and even mental well-being. We strongly encourage the committee to pursue a line inquiry further with the implications are, because the implications are profound, and we hope Professor Shanahan will explain on these points. That brings us directly to funding, accountability and representation. Committee members have already asked where the investment goes. Brian Harvey's report in 2021, Traveller and Homelessness, highlighted the long pattern of underspending, estimating that the HSE Health Service returned large proportions of traveller health funding underspend, sometimes up to 48%. What was the cost of money not used and support not delivered? I'm not sure we've ever heard it clearly stated before the committee that during a suicide crisis, allocated traveller mental health funding returned unspent. We are familiar with local authorities engaging in similar practices, or had. So the question must be asked, if the money was not spent on travellers, how exactly was it spent and on whom? And what are the implications of allocated funding not being used? This does raise the questions of malpractice or failure in state duty of care. There is another issue worth mentioning. Traveller organisations have been often working within the framework of the state. Within the same framework as the state. Many have done valuable work under real constraints. However, funding can be circulated within a relatively small circle of heavily family-orientated organisations. Over time, they can inevitably create gatekeepers, making it difficult for other travellers, new ideas and new approaches to emerge and to participate. We say this not to attack or to lay blame, but if the underlying paradigm is too narrow, then everybody operating within that paradigm is limited by it. We are not suggesting a single cause for the outcomes we see today, but we cannot exclude the possibility of systemic limitations across policy, funding and representation have contributed to the situation we now face. There's also the legal point regarding special measures that must be stated clearly. In the recent periodic report to the United Nations, the state repeatedly uses the term special measures regarding travellers. However, it does so without clearly specifying which legal articles in the Convention these measures are grounded. Under the International Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, special measures, specifically Articles 1.4 and 2.2, are designed to secure equal opportunity or equal employment of rights. What makes this different from the past is crucial. The state wants to apply special treatments to travellers in a conservative or stimulationist way that is evident in the report of the Commission on Itinerancy. I assert special measures under international law are the exact opposite. They are corrective, rights-based, time-bound and judged by outcomes. Because of the state's current language lacks specific legal grounding, what remains unclear is what timelines apply and what success might look like in real human terms. Without that clarity, there's a risk of legal language now being applied to old, failing approaches. Chair, members of the committee, this presentation is not all negative sounding. We're here today with a great deal of hope. We believe that Ireland today and the political institutions of Dublin are more mature, empathetic and capable of engaging in these issues than ever before. We believe this committee has the capacity, the courage and maturity to hold this conversation because there are tangible solutions. Decolonisation, as we use the term, is not a buzzword. It is a genuine process in identifying inherent systems, understanding that they shape outcomes and making evidence-based outcomes. Finally, by moving beyond the reliance of a single discipline and embracing a multidisciplinary approach, we have a pathway towards meaningful change. But to walk that path, we must face the truth. This is a colonial issue. And because it's a colonial issue, it is not only a traveller issue, it is a human issue, and it is a global issue, and it connects us to Indigenous people around the world. The work of healing begins here. So we leave this with the committee, these three questions. What is needed? What is required from us? And what must we do together to finally break this cycle? Our goal is to de-traumatise and decolonise. If we are serious about saving lives, we must be willing to change the framework. We come here before you today in the hope that you will help us answer those questions and help us lead that change. Thank you. We welcome any questions, particularly for Fergus Shanahan on scientific aspects and Dylan Foley on the historical foundations that what we have presented. My apologies for taking so long with that, but we have waited 709 years, so that might count for something. Thank you very much.
Good, Bernard, and it's a very powerful statement, and certainly the work of this committee over the since its inception in this cycle of the Dáil has been very much in that granular day-to-day challenges and the health, the education, the other challenges among the traveller community. This presents with us a much bigger picture in terms of our approach to it. So thank you so much for that. We'll take questions.
Thanks very much for that introduction and that, I suppose we've been dealing here with a lot of the issues in terms of whether it's suicide, whether it's accommodation, whether it's discrimination, and we constantly meet this. And it's interesting to see where you date this back to pre-colonial times, and I'm just a bit puzzled because my read of that over the years was that a lot of families in Ireland during Cromwell and that were pushed off the land, pushed out of their places, and ended up on living off the land. And I don't know whether that's a correct interpretation, but I'd be curious to hear: is there anything correct in that where the traveller culture developed was from that period in this country? I would have thought it was much more further before that, but I'm just curious to hear that.
The culture itself is roughly around 4,800 years
That's
old.
what I was thinking.
It's an indigenous Gaelic culture.
Yeah.
So when Cromwell was putting people off their land, where was he putting them off from but a Gaelic world? And there wasn't necessarily roads back then, so he was pushing them off land into another area. So if you were to ask Fergus Shanahan about microbiome, which is the word of millions of bacteria and fungi within traversers who retain this ancient microbiome, which is very healthy for settled people, for as far as I can gather, that we would say is a non-industrial microbiome. So along comes industrialization. Think industrialization like Cromwell, to create an industrial world, a settlement. So a lot of we would have once been the majority culture, and Cromwell and English colonisation broke it down over many centuries, creating English settlements. This is the term settled Irish comes from. The English would have called them the Lloyd settled, then come Dublin would have called them settled Irish. This is recorded in the Commission report itself. We would be called travellers, tinkers, itinerants, nomads, vagrants, vagabonds, but they're all colonial labels. Our people go by their surnames. So you're talking about at the last of an indigenous clan-based system. And what we're looking at today is the unchanged colonial systems from Cromwell's time that ran through 1922. I'm sure everyone here knows their history when David Lloyd George said that there'd be no changing the systems or there would be a terrible war within 36 hours. So we had to adapt, we had to live with these systems, and we all became a certain kind of Irish, but except for Irish travellers. And of course there are other sections of society like the native Irish speakers, the west of Ireland, who also suffered, the Irish of the north. And this is not to cast blame on Dublin. These were difficult times, decisions had to be made, sustainability had to be brought to the island. At the time I would have probably done the very same thing. If I was on that side I would have agreed with them. But you're not far off. Yeah. Cromwell would have put many of our people onto the so-called roads.
And I'm curious, in Europe, obviously there was a similar trend. You have the Roma people. I assume that followed suit in a similar way when the industrial period started, that created problems within other indigenous populations in Europe and that.
Well, just before I head over to Dylan, because Dylan's an archaeologist, he's studied period history, is that there is a conflation and confusion between Travers and Roma. We are two different cultures, two different origins. They come from North India, again connected to empires, I guess, and the breaking down eventually. But I'll let Dylan take it from there.
Your question with Roma is it a similar process? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm curious, and I understand that Roma and the travellers are different culture in sense. I'm just curious, did something very similar happen in Europe with the Roma or? No, it wouldn't be quite the same in the sense that Roma populations have been traced, as far as I understand, all the way back to India, to North India, where the origin of the population there would be, if you go way far back, but that would be beyond the scope of what we're talking about. They would probably be from Indo-European populations as well. However, their journey, I think, is documented as they're from northern India and into Europe and into Egypt, where they become nicknamed gypsies and things like this, and then gradually moving into Central Europe. So they would move in as a nomadic population into amongst the European population at the time. That's quite different to in Ireland, where we have an indigenous Gaelic culture, which all of people in Ireland would have been involved in at various levels. It would have diversity in itself because it wasn't a centralised culture. but all the way from Western Scotland down to the south of Ireland, we would have a Gaelic world. And you mentioned Cromwell's time. It might be helpful to think about it in these terms. It's not that Cromwell's dispossessing people or that travellers are coming into existence then. You can look at it like that a little bit, but you could also say that what's happening is colonialism is creating the world we now know of where people are settled in and the modern infrastructure of roads, houses, and the towns that we understand now as being normal are only coming into existence then. For most of the country in the 17th century, for example, even stone houses like cottages and things like this would have been called English houses. And they wouldn't have been recognisable to the vast majority of the people once you were outside certain districts in the east here, for example, where there would be heavier English settlement. But vast majority of the country, people would have lived in more temporary dwellings, if that's more clear, you know. But as the conquest is that time you're talking about, 17th century is pivotal in the creation of both settled people. We have the terms still from that era used of, they called them wild Irish and civil Irish. We would call them settled and traveller. And I would suggest that's exactly the same thing.
I go back 30, 40 years. I used to Dunsink, you know, Dunsink Lane and the travellers in Dunsink Lane, and we used to have, in Finglas, we used to have a lot of people camping out in different areas, and I used to be up with them, sitting down with them and having a chat and things. But I've noticed massive changes since then, even in that period where life has changed dramatically, where you have a more settled traveller community in the sense that we have halting sites, we have different things. We don't have the what we had in those days, more so, where you had a lot of continuity, where people travelled different places and had places that they dropped off and they stayed. And that culture has changed tremendously from what I can see over the last number of years. And I'm curious in terms of your opinion in terms of the way society has moved, particularly the traveller community. Do you see that as advancement, or do you see that as sort of taking a bit from the traveller culture, you know?
I'm going to put this one to Fergus Shanahan for the simple reason is, if you was to explain it in a scientific way, the biology of travel versus forced assimilation and what's the benefits, or if that culture changes, does that biology, does that microbiome go away? And if that goes away, who's at a loss? What are the consequences or the implications? Is that fair to put on you?
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, Deputy Alice.
I grew up in the same area. I used to go up to Finglas and know that area very well. And I've always been interested as a settled community person. I have been interested in the travellers and thought I knew a lot about them. And I made the same observations. You couldn't miss the fact that things have changed. You couldn't miss it. And it's evident even in paintings from around the same time. Marky Robinson was painting traveller campsites and had the same kind of thing that we would have seen in Finglas. So I want to tell you a story about, I went away to America and then came back, and I have always wanted to study the travellers in some way, but we found something completely unexpected when we did study them. And I want to tell you about a story of it's completely unexpected, the results. And when you find something unexpected, often that's dismissed as kind of an outlier, kind of like, something unusual, a curio. Or else it can be used as something to learn a lesson from and to challenge conventional thinking. So I'm kind of here really to say to you that I'd like to ask you to think differently about travellers. Like us growing up in the Finglas area, it was always us and them, the settled community, the travellers. And everything you fund and think about for travellers, it's always discussed. You mentioned the racism, the suicide, their poor health. They're not even surviving as long as the rest of us now. And I mean, that's a lot of motivation to do something about it. But it isn't, those things aren't just relevant to that 1% of the population. They're relevant to all of us. There's lessons to be learned here for everyone. But I'm going to tell you one that brings it really home. So we decided to engage with the travellers about 10 years ago. And it took me a long time to get people like you to introduce me to traveller groups in Cork and North Cork. That's where I work, although I'm from Dublin. And after we got through the system and met the committees and convinced them that we weren't just fly-by-night, just going to do a bit of research and disappear, that we were really going to do some engaged research. And by the engaged research, I mean getting the travellers to do the research with us. We didn't do it on them or about them, we did it with them. And it truly was that. And they changed the way in which we asked the research questions. So that's lesson number one. To really, if you're going to do anything on travellers, please be sure that the travellers are not just consulted, that they're full square in the centre, because they know best how to do it, and we've tangible evidence of it. Our work has been published in some of the big journals like Nature. So you can't get anything more prestigious than that. If we tried to publish it in an Irish journal, we would have struggled. We got it published in an international journal because they were fascinated about the work. So what we did was we worked on the microbiome. Now that's just a big word for, it's a collective term for all the bugs, all the bacteria, all of the viruses, all of the fungi that live on you, on all of us, travellers and settled community. And the unexpected finding was, normally with research, you see somebody's a little bit different to someone else, so you might have groups that are a little bit more blood pressure than the others, some of these sort of graduate changes. We found something that was like black and white. We found that the Irish travellers, and it wasn't Roma, we excluded them, we just looked at Irish travellers. They're genetically Irish, so there's no doubt about this. You wouldn't be surprised if I told you that some migrants to Ireland had a different microbiome when you look at all the microbes because of their background. You wouldn't be surprised at that. But you would be shocked to hear that there's a section of the Irish population that have microbes, that is bacteria, viruses, fungi living on them, that are completely different to the rest of the Irish. I don't mean slightly different, I mean black, white, completely different. We found microbes there that we'd never found in any of the other Irish. Now I'm comparing about 100 families of travellers in Cork with 400 native Irish, with 3,000 people from the Western world. And we found that the travellers have what's called a non-industrialised ancient microbiome. The rest of us have a modernised, industrialised microbiome. Now, why is that important? It's important for your health. The microbes actually influence your immune system, your gut health, even your mental welfare. They help your digestion, but they're critically important for health. And it's the hottest story in science. You must hear about everyone from all the talk shows are all talking about the microbiome these days. But I want to tell you, this is a story about the traveller microbiome that is relevant and should be getting traction in the settled community, because the traveller microbiome has actually microbes there that are beneficial for health. So we looked back. There's no doubt they have a shorter lifespan. There's no doubt that they suffer from various manifestations of exclusion, poverty, racism, all those things. When you live in the margins of society, it does affect your general health. But they had microbes that actually were conferring resistance to certain diseases. And I'm talking about things like multiple sclerosis, inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, severe asthma, and bad eczema. They actually have microbes that confer a resistance. So that should be motivation. What is it about that? And shouldn't the settled community be getting the benefits of that? How could we get some of that in a modern world? What are the determinants of that? So we moved on. We couldn't have found this if we hadn't worked with them. They told me the questions to ask before we ever knew the research. There's a thing called a case report form that you collect all these questions. You do your piece of research, and then you relate it back to the questions you'd asked the volunteers. It turned out that the three things that were really important that determined that unusual microbiome were sibling count, number one, the number of siblings in a traveller family. Who would have thought of it? Now, I've done 40 years worth of research, and I can tell you can go into any hospital in Ireland, and does the doctor ever ask about the number of siblings you have? They'll ask about family history, all right, but they won't say, well, how many siblings is in your family? You might get that from the census report, but you don't get that in the history. But the traveller said, you need to ask about that, because that's something that we're different about. We did. That came out as number one determinant. Number two was their accommodation, living in close quarters. And number three was exposure to animals in childhood, particularly horses. Horses came out sky high. So this would have been an ordinary publication in any ordinary journal and forgotten about if it weren't for the fact, again, this shows the value of working with the travellers and not doing something about them without them. They told me about the Housing Act of 2002, which was the culmination of a lot of legislation, and you know more about this than I do, but that effectively put travellers off the road and put them into halting sites and into state-sponsored housing. But it effectively removed the nomadism. Now, it's not nomadism that gave them that microbiome. It's the circumstances of your life that are necessary when you are nomadic. You're living together. You're sleeping in the same bed often. You're living in close quarters. You're sharing the microbes. Now, you got your microbes from your mother. I got my microbes from your mother. We all got them from our mother. But you share them. You transfer them to amongst your siblings. And if you're living in a house all alone, now the census tells us that the average sibling count in Ireland is around 1 to 2 per family. If you're rattling around in a nice big house, 1 to 2, you're not sharing very many microbes. But if you're living amongst 10, and 10 was the average sibling count in our study, by the way. If you're living amongst 10, you're sharing them. You're sharing them with animals, you're sharing them with the circumstances you're in. What we found was, we were able to get longitudinal perspective on that. There's something very sad about this. That microbiome, the one thing that the travellers have that's actually good for their health, it's actually being eroded, it's diminishing, it's vanishing as our culture is vanishing. Why do I say that? Because we were able to study travellers who had been nomadic in childhood. The story is, if you were nomadic in childhood and now you're in a halting site, not a house, now you're in a halting site, you've retained your microbiome largely. You've got an ancestral ancient microbiome. If the opposite is the case, if you were in a house as a child and still in a house, you've got an industrialized microbiome like my own and like all of us in this room other than travellers. But there was an intermediate group. If you were nomadic in childhood and now are in a house, you're losing your microbiome. That's the group that's losing their microbiome. So we have absolute tangible evidence that as we erode our culture, as we build houses, as we put them into conditions that are not culturally sensitive, they're losing this. The very thing that you and I observed in Finglas. Some of it's good if we followed through, if we gave them the education, if we do actually properly plumb and sanitize the halting sites and deliver on the promises that we made to them. If we kept those, some of that's good. Of course, travellers want proper sanitation, but they do need to still be able to pursue the culture that they've had. Now, we found this with the microbiome. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not important, but it does show that continual public health policies of using words like assimilation. In other words, make the problem of this 1% go away by making them like the rest of us. Put them into our schools, put them into houses, make them look like us, give them all these things, and forget about their culture, just make them like us. You're actually eroding something that just because you can't see it, it's a big determinant of their health that's being eroded. I believe the microbiome is just one example of actually how the adverse effects of these kinds of policies is actually damaging their health as well. And I think it extends all the way to, if you're losing your identity and your culture, you're probably losing an awful lot more than just your microbiome. But my bigger point is that this is an issue that's of relevance to the settled community. I'm interested in this because I'd like the benefits. A non-industrialized microbiome that the travellers have actually has lower antibiotic resistance genes in it, is better suited to digestion of things like dietary fibre, is actually negatively associated. In other words, it gives you resistance to a whole variety of immune-mediated diseases that were never even questioned in the All-Ireland Traveller Health Study of 15 to 20 years ago. They told us all about suicide and longevity and all these other things, and they're important, of course, cancer, all these things, but they never studied the things that travellers are resistant to. That's an important side of the story, and it should be motivation enough. And I'd ask that you consider, if you've any influence on the way funding is done, it should be travellers full centre to influence the way the study is done and to even conduct the study themselves. Because you mentioned about their research to that. They've actually got research fatigue, and the reason it took me so long to win them over was they just had to get to know me and trust me. But they did the study for us. I did the bit in the lab, but they actually really gave us the pearls of the data that actually convinced the editor of Nature to publish our study. And it's been circulated all around the world now, but curiously, not much traction in Ireland.
Thanks. We might move on, if that's okay. And Senator Byrne.
Thanks. Thank you very much indeed for your presentations. And I suppose I'm chairperson of a community centre where the Limerick City Traveller Health Network are actually based. So I know we would have regular contact with the I suppose the people that are working there, you know, and they'd often bring us into some of their briefings, or, you know, if they have visitors at that, and it can be very interesting. But I suppose a few things that frightened me in your report. Number one was that even to this day, longevity, you know, is quite low in the traveller community. And from what I can gather from Mr. Shanahan, is that the fact that people living in maybe halting sites in mobile homes versus the people in the houses, that they are the people, or is it right across the travelling community, maybe is the first question. And then you spoke about having a multidisciplinary approach. In your opinion, what would that look like? Maybe two opening questions.
First of all, to say that there's been a lot of research done globally. Yeah. Tracy Westerman comes to mind, and the link between Aboriginal children and colonialism around identity and giving rise to child suicides. So, and what I mean by multidisciplinary is that for the last 40, 50, maybe 60 years, there's been just one discipline that has ruled over our community, and that's been sociology. And while it has shown to be useful, it does not incorporate everything. And the particular one we're talking about was born out of a former nun and a former priest who happened to get married, open up an old Protestant church, and then for the next 40, 50 years never removed, well, she never removed herself from a position of power. So when they teach about community development principles, it's about engagement, about empowerment, about working where the community is at. But this became a preaching thing rather than a practice thing. So where a multidisciplinary approach means archaeology, it means microbiology, it means geneticists, it means psychology, psychiatry. All these are other disciplines that have never been really incorporated. Because if you think about it, how do the people end up with one of the most healthiest microbiomes in the Western world? Much healthier than the settled population, but you end up with the worst psychological problems of any people in Europe, if not the world. If you could take our stats and compare them to all the other indigenous people around the world, you'll find almost identical outcomes: high levels of suicide, chronic psychological issues, addiction issues, crime issues. And we believe a lot of that is related to colonialism. And a decolonisation process is most certainly required, but above all else, positive research. We believe that even telling other travellers about the microbiome, give them a lift. Give them that sense of, oh wow, we have an old microbiome, it's really healthy, rather than asking them about their siblings committing suicide and destitute and so on and so forth. Fergus, go ahead.
Just very quickly, you asked about, is it in halting sites or in different places?
Yeah.
Just very briefly, you can have two opposing things. You can have something happening that's bad for one aspect of your health and something also happening that's actually beneficial. It turns out that that the people who scored the best in terms of what we'd call the best microbiome, the most diverse, the most non-industrialized, were actually the people in the halting site. And we did a WHO wellness assessment on all the travellers. The people who actually scored, if you like, the happiest were actually the people in the halting site. Now, a lot of us would look at the halting site and say, but it doesn't have proper sanitation, and it's overcrowded and all. That's true. But what it did do is it allowed people to, if you like, resist the modernisation, resist the erosion of their culture, and it allowed them to keep their animals. Maybe in overcrowded and all the other things, but it actually did give them something that helped them. They were the ones that retained. If I were to pick and just blindly pick where would I like to get a traveller and be sure I could tell you that one is a non-industrialised good microbiome, I'd go to a halting site, not to someone who's been in a house.
And maybe just to pick up on something else, because you were saying that, I suppose, when you did the test, it was shown that maybe the microbiome sorry, I'm pronouncing it
Yes,
wrong
good
now.
enough.
The microbiome, sorry, were coming from animals and you know, whether it was horses and the close proximity.
Yeah, they're not getting them from there. What happens is animals allow you to transfer. You go from human to animal back to another human. That's the way it works.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And is it that, we'll say maybe that if the animals were being treated maybe properly through veterinary products, we'll say to do with whatever is grown on their skin or whatever, would that help?
It's just access to the animals, because there's been a small study picking up on our work actually in Italy, taking children, urbanized children, and bringing them to, if you like, they called it a pet zoo, but it was just horses. It was just horses, and in a structured way, get him to pet the animal and then learn how to ride the animal. But just being exposed to horses actually changed their microbiome.
Okay, because I suppose if you were to look at, we'll say, and I suppose horses, dogs, the whole lot have always been a tradition within the travelling communities, and many communities, many people have them at home in their own homes or farms or whatever. You know, is it so when you're talking about a multidisciplinary approach, you're talking about that the animals need to be looked after as much as the human in terms of passing on, I suppose, different you know, things living on your skin and that. So I suppose that, you know, you're looking at a wider picture.
One of the suggestions I'd actually written a bit of paper and I sent it on to Fergus last year. And basically it was around a horse health farm ran by travellers, because both of them go together. It's part of biology, traveller and the horse. They are one shared microbiome. So a health farm where it would be open to all members of the community, particularly settled children and particularly in housing estates where industrialisation have cut them off from their natural diverse microbiome. So to have a health farm like that would be very beneficiary to all people, I believe, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, settled people know about young kids who go to a creche. They make them home with runny noses and all the viruses they get, but they get beneficial microbes as well. They tend to have lower risk of allergies. All those things are good for them, but mixing humans at an early age, but particularly mixing them with exposing them to animals. Good for mental health as well. Good for children to see life and death of animals when it's in all kinds of subliminal ways that we can't necessarily measure, but we know are correct.
Yeah.
And I should have said at the beginning also that we are the ones that have diverged. The travellers with their non-industrialised microbiome, that is the ancient microbiome. We've seen in other countries all around the world, as people undergo modernisation, industrialisation, they start to get diseases that were once rare, but it correlates with the change in the microbiome. And when people have studied ancient stool, ancient feces that has been stored in either desiccated or salted conditions or in permafrost, those microbiomes are actually very like the microbiome that you see in modern hunter-gatherers or in the travellers. But the travellers are absolutely unique. They're very distinct from the settled community in the Western world. But they're also different from hunter-gatherers in Africa and in Mongolia. They share the fact that they're different, but they're differently different. There is a uniqueness about the Irish travellers.
No. Thank you for your thought-provoking research. Certainly it is, you know, thank you.
Thank you. And Senator O'Reilly. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. And I suppose my initial, of course, to welcome you here, and thank you for your presentations. And it's all fascinating. Even at an academic level, it's fascinating. But of course, our job is to try to apply it to real life, but it's a fascinating discussion and reading. I'd like to read more of it and understand it better on a purely intellectual academic level, but then our function here is to see to how can we bring that to affect lives for the better. But again, I'm like my colleague, the last Catholic of the Shannon, Senator Byrne, I'm going to focus initially on Professor Shanahan's work, forcing populations with older non-industrial life ways into settled environments alters biology and affects the specific special microbiome that you discovered.
it affects immunity, etc. And what was very scary from my point of view, because you could there was other compensatory elements in the settled life maybe for some of that, but what was the one that led the depression, I think that's a very serious thing. If you like that, maybe good housing could alter some of the other issues. The depression is a very disturbing one. Just in practical terms, for legislators, for policy implementers, for civil servants or whatever, while this is all fascinating, there's not much we can do about it, is there? But would you, if you could answer two things, the question, there's not much we can do about it in reality. If we're to do what Pavy Point would ask if they were in next week, there's not much we can do. And on the other hand, would you focus in on the depression bit, because that's very concerning? You know what I mean? If I'm making myself a little bit clear.
Yeah, I will. I'm not saying it's easy. Nothing is easy. We wouldn't be here if any of this was easy.
If you're not saying it's easy, how would you do it if you were given the policy role in the morning?
Well, I've mentioned one thing. I wouldn't just consult with traveller groups, and it wouldn't just be Pavy Point, incidentally. They're just in the same way that settled community are represented by many different political parties at different times. The travellers, are entitled to multiple organisations, and that's not to make it more difficult. That's just a fact of life. Why shouldn't they have? But so I would certainly have travellers not just consulted, but have them very much involved in the policy changes, if there's going to be changes. I think that one thing that we can't just shrug our shoulders and say, what can we do about it? I'm reminded of what John Hume said in his Nobel laureate when he got the Nobel Prize, made the point that difference and diversity is the essence of humanity. And we should be not trying to assimilate the travellers and deal with the traveller, quote, problem. We should actually be celebrating the fact that we actually have what a fascinating ethnic group we have that lots of other countries don't have. I mentioned about migrants. It wouldn't be unusual to find a non-industrialised microbiome in a migrant, and we know from migrants that their health deteriorates when they actually come into an opposing culture. So here we have a chance with 1% of our population, and maybe more than that, to actually try and make a difference. So all I would do is keep beating the same drum. Let's not repeat the mistakes of the past. Let's not keep talking about it as one of assimilation. Let's find ways in which the travellers can actually live in Ireland, juxtaposed with the settled community, but at least in culturally sensitive ways. I'm not asking for the sun, moon and stars, but I do think there must be ways to actually allow them to have access to their horses. If you call it horse projects or whatever you want to do, there have to be ways to approach that. There are other things that can be done. If they've got a microbiome that's quite distinct from the settled community, what's normal? What do we call normal anymore? So what are the dietary recommendations for travellers? If you've got a microbiome, for example, I'll give you an example from the migrant community. If you have a microbiome that's well suited to a situation in, say, Africa, where you're only sporadically accessible, you can access food, you're in a famine-torn country, you tend to have a microbiome that actually extracts the maximum amount of energy and calories out of the food you're able to get. If you transport that person with their microbiome into Ireland in an obesogenic environment, they'll actually get all the diseases we've had, and even worse, much faster, because they have a microbiome that's not suited to that diet at all. Yet we've one public health organisation that actually, there's only one diet, and this is the diet that's suitable for everyone. There should be various diets for different people. That's another example. There are diseases that the travellers are actually resistant to. Now, we've enough bad stories about susceptibility to diseases. Here's one where we've actually got, and I'm talking about diseases that they won't kill you, but they're a scourge. Who hasn't got someone at home that hasn't got bad allergy or bad asthma, bad allergies, or some sort of arthritis, or some immune-mediated disorders that the travellers are actually resistant to? Why aren't we looking at that? So there are things that actually people can start thinking differently about.
I do want...
On the depression issue, I personally think, but while I could spin you a microbiome story, and I've got colleagues who passionately believe, and there's a huge literature on the microbiome influencing brain health, There's no doubt that animals who are kept germ-free, microbe-free, have distorted behaviour and have depressive-like behaviour. I personally think if there was never such a thing as a microbiome, if you take away people's culture, inadvertently, not unwittingly, you actually remove their sense of identity, and you'll see the same thing in every culture, whether it be the Inuit in North America, the Native American Indians, or original First Nation status in other countries. You'll get the same kind of depression and suicide issues as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that very fascinating answer. Before I come back to your idea of a democratic assembly for travellers, just to run one or two factual things past you. You say that local authorities not spend, well, you're saying the allegation is there that local authorities are not spending money on travellers. We had the local authorities in last week, in the absence of a lot of our Dáil colleagues here. They were just, while the senators were left, I put those questions to the local authority people. It said you're not spending, blah, blah. They are adamant that the money for travellers is ring-fenced and the Auditor General's, etc., and that they are spending it on travellers. Now, I know you might argue as to how you spend it, that's a debate, but they are saying it is a false allegation that they're not.
I'll put it back.
Could you provide evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe I can. One, they've changed the system slightly. One, they slightly changed the system. Before you would allocate a particular sum of money to local authorities to draw down to spend on travel accommodation. I once asked Fine Gael, this is an article in the paper, so it's in the public domain also, TD David Staunton, and I asked her, where does the money go? I mean, does it go back to the Exchequer? Where does the unspent money go? And he initially put an article in the paper saying that the unspent money goes into settled projects. So the money that wasn't drawn down for travel accommodation went back into settled projects. So I think the system has slightly changed now.
And do you dispute their contention of last week? You can look at the blacks yourself. You can look at it and see if I'm understanding it correctly. Do you dispute their contention that the money, they would, if they were sitting with you today, they would say, we're spending the money on travellers? You might question how we're spending it.
I would say a lot of what I've said that in the past I would have witnessed, say, in terms of they might spend it on evictions. They might have bulldozers, JCBs. A lot of cases went to court in the years ago, particularly Mayo, through their profile solicitors. And the council were fighting all these legal standings on behalf of travellers. So where would that money come from? And the money that wasn't spent, where does it go to and who was it spent on? According to David Staunton, it goes back into...
If you're able, it might be very helpful to the committee if you could supply the Secretariat here with evidence if you have it.
I take David's word that if he says he said it and if he put it in the paper, he's an honest guy, so I would imagine he would say that.
All right. You were saying...
Could I mention...
Sorry.
Can I just say something that... In relation to there's not much you could do, but I would suggest that there's quite a lot you could do, and that it's one of the reasons that we frame it in terms of colonialism is precisely because, not because it's an irrelevant thing, but because it's the whole thing, in the sense that originally a lot of the body of law that came through and what we regard as norms, like Professor Shanahan was saying, come from a time that we're all aware of in history, where the whole point was to assimilate the entire Irish population into a certain way of living and a certain type of system. Yeah.
That's exactly what my third question was about. You say that we need decolonialisation, and that it was colonialisation that led to a lot of the traveller difficulties, because whatever, we're not discussing what it meant for settled people today, but that it done a lot of the traveller difficulties. It got rid of nomadism and so. But it's a contradiction. Are you saying that land was removed from them by colonialism? Surely if there are nomad people, they wouldn't have land per se.
Well, the term nomad is also a colonial label. Gaelic clans moved in particular tuas in certain circles. Not all Gaelic clans wandered endlessly around the place. As Mr. Ellis pointed out earlier on, his story would have been that Cromwell put us off our land. Well, it must have been on land to be put off land in the first place. And then in 1652, you've got the Settlement of Ireland Act. And this is the commencement of creating English settlements that we later called settled Irish. And these are labels we didn't call settled people. We didn't call settled people settled people.
So if they were nomadic before then, they were moving to different parcels of land at different times a year.
This is something Dylan would have studied in his...
Yeah, it wouldn't be straight. It would be straightforward in the sense that you have to understand that what we now call nomadic would have been from the colonial point of view. If you imagine Dublin, if you imagine the Pale or London, whatever way you want to look at it, that they're looking out at a world beyond the Pale that they don't understand. That beyond the Pale they call nomadic, whether it is or not. One of the reasons for that would be that they would have been they would have used Roman law, which would have meant that if the land was inhabited only by nomads, it was legal to confiscate the land under English law, and therefore everyone was a nomad, even if they weren't. If you see what I mean.
I had a last question. Well, and just very briefly, just your assembly. Maybe I'll wait till you come.
Do you want to come in?
No, well, I'll go with
question,
it.
yeah.
Your proposition of the assembly, would you just see that as a talking shop, or what would be talked about there, and what decisions would be there?
Really quick things on that.
Because I think that is I think that's a good policy.
That leads into this. One is that we are the only foundation, probably on the planet, that has brought this narrative together. And the only way we could have done that was by using multiple different disciplines: geneticists, microbiology, archaeology, psychiatry, political science, all of that. And the question about, we keep saying there's a lot you can do. Ireland has signed up to the United Nations international law in 1968 that ratified that in 2000. So there are obligations on behalf of the state to create corrective measures to iron these issues out. They're not fixed, they're not special treatment, they're just to fix what is broken. For the Assembly, we believe that there should be an Assembly where travellers have democracy. Like this state has already shown that, Dublin has shown that, this committee has shown that. You've allowed us in the door, you welcomed us here, you allowed us to speak freely. That is very democratical, that's very good of you to do that. We would say that because we've been governed with one discipline for a very long time, sociology, that there isn't really a process of democracy. We don't select or elect our people to represent us. They're handpicked primarily by settled people who come in here and speak to you. That's the direction that has been going for a long time. We would slightly like to change that and give it fair representation. Because we don't believe in dismantling systems or tearing down systems. We believe in building them up and making them better.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks. I'll move on to Deputy Collins.
Thanks, Chairperson. And Senator O'Reilly has asked some of the questions there, particularly in relation to the Assembly, that I was going to ask as well. I think it's very interesting. I think we felt here we were dealing with 100 years of state legacy in the committee, and that issues had arisen through, I suppose, from the foundation of the state. But to see that it predated that nearly makes it more challenging for us, because it's very difficult to undo history. And I know, and I fully recognise your stance that some of that, I suppose, some of where we found ourselves is as a result of political bigotry. And I appreciate that to be the case. I'm just wondering, in terms of that term I use there, undoing history, and in terms of how we can try now to make sure that obviously the state won't continue in that vein. We would hope that that would just be that education and natural awareness of issues has made sure that we, going forward, will be more aware of needs and are more inclusive in our decision-making process. But there is the issue, and you've touched on it in terms of trying to generate the involvement or participation of members of the travelling community in the political system. And what's the greatest barrier?
Just before I head on to Dylan, because it is a specialty around history, and I like to defer everything if I can, as much as possible. But you're right about one thing. We can't change history. We can't go back in time. But what we can do is we can change how we think about history. And if we continue to think that travellers are some kind of subculture or byproduct since the formation of the state, that's a false narrative. To think that travellers are ethnic in the sense that they're like Roma and other ethnic groups is not true. It's more accurate to say that they're an indigenous people. They're people that were born out of the land with a very natural biology to support that. So it isn't a case of something that I feel and I think, it's something that's supported with science. The Assembly would be just that. It's about trying to incorporate as much as possible that's good about a bad situation. There is no blaming the finger. We're not blaming Dublin, we're not blaming settled people. This is a complex issue. And whatever we do has to be for the betterment of all people, not just travellers.
Right, can I just ask you, Bernard, do you not feel we're at that point? You know, you made the point there a moment ago, like that, I suppose, for lack of a better term, the us and them. Do you not think we've overcome that?
I don't think that's evident in the state policies that has targeted travellers since the 1960s. They had 2 censuses in the 1 year. They encouraged the councils to maximise all force to keep travellers moving till eventually they broke them down. They even talked about putting a yellow badge on us so the guards could identify us, but they threw that out because they said it would cost too much in expenses. That report is pretty much evident to this day. So we've been the target of the state, as we have been since the colonisers came. Like, they call us travellers now, but we're not always called travellers. We've been Gaelic clans primarily. So it's systematically and subconsciously, and again, it's important I say this, we're not blaming settled people. We don't believe that anyone in Dublin gets up in the morning and presses a button to hurt people or drive children over the edge. We don't believe that for a second. It's systematic, and we believe our foundation is in a good position to help change that paradigm that actually benefits Ireland beyond imagination, because this is a global story. Ireland was the first laboratory for English colonisation. It went to the West Virginia, went to Canada, Jamaica, 57 other places around the world. So we hold a very unique knowledge in Ireland that if we come together, we could change global history.
If I could give an example of...
And then
I'll give a quick example. Sorry, just a quick example of continuity would be the 1963 report. That there's not for no reason. It's not just talking about Old English law or things like that. But in this 1963 report invoked the 1847 Vagrancy Act as law that was relevant to the situation and to the policy that would be happening in the state from then on. And I think that shows that, directly the body of law carried through, including the attitude to, like, these people are a problem, the way of life is an issue, and we'd be doing them a favour if we changed this and that. And in terms of like how to address these things, I would suggest, although I'm no legal scholar, but I would look at that decision that Bernard might mention.
George Hogan, 2022,
2022. There was a case where I believe the judge in the Supreme Court, George Hogan, gave a very interesting decision where he solved a case that was being taken up between councils and between the council and travellers in Clare, I believe, over housing. And he identified that most of the issue there was actually the interpretation of what is a house by the courts. And therefore, all he did was widen the interpretation of house to include what the traditional way that travellers had lived. And I would suggest this type of thing, which allows for that diversity to exist by recognising the original origins of the law in the country and how it was designed to interfere with ways of life that were older than the state, and then we're able to apply a remedy without even that much difficulty involved.
And just, Bernard, on the core question then, incentivising members of the travelling community to become participants in the political process. What's the greatest barrier, and what's the greatest thing we can do to generate that incentivisation?
Yeah, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. And my understanding was that the Senate itself, initially, the idea of it was for the Protestant minority at the time, was it? I don't know how true that is. But if it was it? That's true.
I think so, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, so the idea, so therefore, if we had an assembly, we would elect and select a traveller, 2 travellers, or a few travellers that would be automatically co-opted into the Senate and maybe even the Dáil. And I think that would be a fair representation of our community. If we go through the process of the wider one, as you know yourself, and you just touched on it, the prejudice and the built-in prejudice, the subconscious attitudes that are held against travellers, it's almost an impossible task for a traveller to get elected. But if this process would, assembly would help a lot with that. I just want to give that.
May I just add one small point that echoes the previous question, an earlier question about what simple things can be done, and also your question, the message of a badge being worn by travellers. No one wants a stigma, but the travellers were given separate ethnic status in 2017. Now, have we moved on from that? Can we take advantage of that? Every time you go into an Irish hospital, you could be asked anything from, are you a Caucasian, are you a Red Indian, are you a Roman Catholic, or what on earth you are, and you have the choice to ignore it or answer that question. But there is no box for the traveller to have a unique identifier there. There is no box that asks, you know, are you a traveller? Now, obviously, they can choose to, if it were there, they can choose to ignore it or have it there. But by having something like that there, oodles of research could be done that would cost nothing practically. I've just spent a couple of years recently, after finding the microbiome changes, we predicted certain diseases would be less common in travellers. And it's taken ages, with hard sweat, to actually get the data to prove that's the case, and we did. It could have been done like that on the computer record. If that little box were signaled, we would be able to cross-check these diseases, and you could get your suicide, your depression, all these things have a number, all those diseases. And if we could link it back, I could link it back to Catholicism or whatever religion you have. I can link it back to whether you say you're Caucasian, this, that, and the other, all of which is irrelevant. I can't link it back in an instance to travellerhood. And that's a simple change that is a logical extension from Enda Kenny giving them separate ethnic status. Simple little things can be done if people were being sensitive and thinking forward. That wouldn't cost an awful lot, wouldn't cost anything, and actually would save an awful lot of money. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
There was only one other question I had. You might get a brief answer briefly, but it's just in the submission as well, you referenced the poor outcomes from existing settled traveller interfaces. Are you concerned that that's going to continue?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Just when you talk about the Traveller Assembly, strengthening the political representation of travellers, you talk about the poor outcomes from existing settled traveller interfaces.
I think it's fair to say that everything that has been tried up to this point, every infrastructure, every funding project, has resulted in children dying. So that's the outcome we're left with now, and that's a harsh reality. It's not because people are ill-intentioned or anything like that. It's just that the paradigm and the way they were working within that framework was incorrect. I think we need to change that. We need to give travellers back their history, their culture and their identity. Even framing us as traveller and Roma is confusing for young travellers because we're not Roma. We didn't come from North India. We don't go around saying put Catholics and Protestants in one group because you're all the one. It doesn't make sense. You've got different cultures, different origins, different stories, and so on. So minor corrections that sound even silly saying them, but they have a profound effect on self-identity and...
Am I misinterpreting that, Bernard, that you're critical of, we say, how the government fund organisations that are intended to assist the travelling community?
I'm critical of the points here where there's one dominant discipline ruling over travellers, which all of the travel organisations use the discipline of sociology. There is no archaeology, there's no historians or microbiologists or geneticists or linguistics, where our foundation has incorporated a multitude of different disciplines to come up with a rock-solid version. And that's why you've never heard people come in before talking about ongoing colonial institutions. And just one point of reference, it's a minor one. It could easily argued that there wasn't even a formation of the state. It was a continuation of the colonial state.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. And Senator Rabbit.
Thank you very much. It's a thought-provoking conversation that we're having today, to be quite honest with you. And you know, I sort of disagree with you on some things. And no, it's no, I think it's you, Bernard, I'm disagreeing with. But anyways, and the reason I disagree, and not wholeheartedly, okay, take it in jest. Like you talk about the tiering of into the Shannon, into the Dáil. I sort of disagree with you on that, because see, there's plenty of parties and independents that there is nothing stopping. Like I came into politics because I hooked myself up to Fianna Fáil and I got elected. I'm going, and why can't you do the same? As opposed to saying we need to have X number in the Shannon and X number in the Dáil, or X number in the Shannon. You'd have well worked out there, and I'm just pushing back a little, because I do believe, like I'm from Galway, the same as John is, and we have a very strong, vibrant traveller community in Galway, very articulated in their viewpoints. And I would say, can you not join a political party and come out and get elected? We'd be delighted to have more people joining political parties. And I'm not just talking for my own party now, I'm talking for all.
I wouldn't disencourage travellers to do exactly that. I would say that I think you already have them kind of systems in place. Even with the Senate, you have people who come through the universities, people who come through various other groups, I believe, quotas maybe even. Every so
for
often,
women.
Sorry?
That's for the women.
Well, we've got traveller women too.
Oh yeah, exactly.
The Senate sometimes selects people, I believe, or the Taoiseach.
Nominates,
so there is processes you do have within your community that helps those who might be otherwise disadvantaged or excluded for some reason or another. Why don't all them people just join a political party and get elected that way? Why have that system at all? So I would say it's not like this falls under Ireland's obligation. These are legal binding obligations Ireland has under international law to put in corrective measures that help the people in a situation that they've exhausted every other avenue. As we know, travellers have exhausted every avenue. When it comes to education, it's now they're using the language again of segregation, time-reduced tables. We've got over-representation in the prison services, health issues. For a very long time, there was only two departments dealing with travellers, the Department of Justice and the Department of Health. But if you were a settled person, you could go to the Department of Arts or the Department of elsewhere. But we always were funneled through these two departments. That could be seen as a form of apartheid. So those things happen sometimes subconsciously because they were happening and become normalised. So we're trying to break that cycle, but we can't do it alone, of course. We need your support and help.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. And like I would have advocated, and the chair will agree with me here, for the health identificator. I have championed for that since I think I've come into this.
I've heard several times you talk, and I was always impressed. So
yeah, so like I've absolutely advocated because we should have that. So as we can track and we can actually identify and support. So I'm totally there with you on it, Fergus. I see everything as an equal. So maybe I have a different sort of a glass, because I actually think that we need to have equal conversations, not segregated conversations. I believe in the whole integration of the system, because if we can do it that way, it's a fairer society for all, not for just one cohort or another.
Again, it sounds sometimes what I'm saying is separatist, but I would say look at where we're at the present moment with the language of inclusion. So we would say integrated into what exactly? Inclusion, included into what? If everything that's happened up to this point has resulted in a community, we're the only community in Europe that actually got worse since the 1960s. Like in the report it said we had better mental health in the settled population. There was no travellers in the mental institutions, but there was lots of settled people. The travelled children were as equally apt and as intelligent as settled children. Fast forward 70 years and we have some of the worst outcomes on the planet, if not Europe. So how did that happen? What caused that? Even with good intentions, funding, all these things are put in infrastructure. How does that get worse? How does something that was framed to be good end up getting so bad? So we're saying those are not trying to create separatist divisions. We believe in healing the divisions, that the traveller label and the settled label are both colonial labels. They're born out of colonisation, and Fergus Shanahan would tell you the microbiology knows nothing about traveller settled labels. It's still a human situation we have.
And Chair, I'm just going to finish on one point. Like, I think it's a fascinating conversation at a real high level. I think it's more than us that need to be understanding this conversation, to be quite honest with you. But you talk about the microbiome. Am I pronouncing that correct?
Yes.
I am. See, I'm a huge lover of horses. So I actually would believe so much in equine therapy, as the Chair and John know about. And see, I believe all people benefit from interaction with the horse. Absolutely. So the horse for children that are non-verbal. So you talk about where do we have the horses as part of the culture of the travelling community, but absolutely at the same time ingrained within the community. Clondalkin is a great example of the horse project in Clondalkin. The horses in the Clondalkin project are part of the primary care integration team, of where children who need access to OTs, like the only place in the country that we have trained occupations from primary care delivering intervention for children with additional needs is abroad in Clondalkin. and we see the value of the horses in Liskinnet, and I'm trying to get a horse project to Tuam for the same reason. We have a large traveller population living in Tuam. The horse is the most natural, but also what it can do for everybody from a microbiome point of view, but also from a domestic violence point of view. There's huge studies done in the UK that where women or men who have access to horse therapy, their healing recovery is way higher when they have access to that equine therapy piece, believe it or not. And perhaps they're people that come from the traveller community as well. So, like, I think we agree on an awful lot, to be quite honest with you. It's how we can integrate the cultural piece into modern day life. And I'm talking about health outcomes, early intervention, but it's early intervention for everybody, not just one.
I say that we would agree from one of the reasons with to mention it in terms of history is that one of the downsides of what happened in the period in the 60s and other times was the the blocking of the history of travellers, and the report in 63 that said that they wouldn't actually look into the history, and that had a very bad effect in the sense that I was just going to say that it's not just them that gets cut off. What happens is the whole country gets cut off from an awful lot of history. So I'm agreeing with you in that sense that it would be beneficial to the whole country and to everyone in the country by reconnecting and doing the research like Professor Shanahan into to reconnect all of the history of the traveller community actually will open a lot of our history to the whole population. I would suggest.
And I agree, and my last bit is Ian McDonough, a traveller from Galway that both myself and John know. He would have gone to the BT Young Scientists, I'd say 6 years ago at this stage, and he brought the history of the traveller to the BT Young Scientists. He got a recognition of it because he was educating all other young people there about the history of the traveller, the role of the 10, the role of what the travelling community did, and he talked about his grandparents, he talked about his parents, and that is the cultural, educational and awareness that perhaps, and I have to compliment Maryland College in supporting him to get to that level. Maybe that's another piece, Dylan, that we have to look at, or having it within the likes of the BT flagship opportunities for telling the stories, because they're very positive ones.
Just going
I couldn't agree more with you about the integration and about the horse projects. And curiously, I've said to Bernard that if we do a microbiome proper study in relation to horses, just targeting specifically that has to be with the settled community and with the travellers. It makes no scientific sense to do it separately. And there's a lady in Guelph in Canada who studies North American Indians and this whole issue about horses' mental health. And she comes from a veterinary perspective, makes the point that there's something about the horse. Dogs are good and cats, I suppose, but there's something special about a horse that actually has a greater benefit. She couldn't explain it, but her data are very strong. And now that I'm in this exalted position in this house, I may never get a chance again. I have to say, we live in a country that gives tax abatement, tax incentives, that has made some people multi-billionaires in the horse industry. There's few of them and knocking around Ireland. We give this huge tax abatement to a horse industry. Wouldn't it be great if a small amount of that went to some of these horse projects that you're talking about, that it could actually benefit an awful lot of us for our mental health and I believe our microbiome as well. But it is quite a disparity that we have struggled to get the funding for horse projects while this vast amount of money is being made in the horse industry otherwise.
I absolutely agree. Thanks I just want to ask a few questions myself. I probably apologise to other members. I probably let the conversation flow a bit, so I think it's been absolutely fascinating. I just wanted to ask Dylan a more specific question, really, around archaeological excavations of settlements, of family settlements and of nomadic settlements. What evidence is there of that across the landscape in Ireland, and are there differences in different settlements in terms of findings? Because I'm sure roads projects, etc., but also in urban settlements, that there must be evidence of nomadic peoples travelling across the country?
I worked on quite a few of these road projects years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the areas of settlement would be. What strikes you really is that is the light touch that kind of, let's say, Gaelic culture would have had on the country, and that it would have been the norm probably right up till almost the 19th century, but certainly into the 17th and 18th century. In large parts of the country, particularly the west, but also even close to Dublin, even Wicklow and places, that stone buildings just weren't the norm. There were stone churches, stone castles, but the people didn't live in stone buildings. And so we just don't see them. When you open the massive road lines and you see all the things, yes, we see sites where huts were and things like this, but we don't see lots of stone buildings. That would be the first thing. And in the areas of English settlement, or more heavily continental or English settlement in the southeast or east, you would have more of them earlier, if you know what I mean, stone buildings and things like that. Other than that, it's the classic ring fort and wicker, I believe. And so it looks like most of the population lived in what we would now regard as temporary housing. But they didn't see it that way. The nomadism would have been, you know, like what do they call it, transhumanism, you know, the bringing cattle up the mountains
Which
in the summer.
Still do it in the Burren and
Exactly, and bringing them back down in the winter. They have villages that would change size throughout the year. In autumn they would be full, you know, you'd have the fairs, things like this. So you have a population that was, like we talked earlier when we mentioned it, there is a lot of history involved of this idea of, yes, the population was more mobile in general, obviously. And the idea, though, of full nomad thing is more of there's more of a designation by the government, if you know what I mean, as that government is starting to change that world. And that's a different thing.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to wrap up in terms of the contributions from yourselves and your statement and from the members, and it's really trying to take in your findings, your really rich findings and important work that you've done. We had the Heritage Council here with us a number of months ago, and they're in conclusion in drafting the first Traveller Heritage Strategy. They have a heritage officer working specifically with the traveller community. So do you see an opportunity here in actually using your work to embed a whole greater understanding between traveller and settled, but also in societal understanding of these the cultural issues in particular, and how that could perhaps help shape a different approach than we've been taking to date?
I honestly, truly believe that because we've been at this so long, and the narrative for a lot of people seems relatively new, but it's kind of old for ourselves because we've been working on it for a very long time. This isn't just beneficiary to travellers in the situation we're in, which is an emergency. It isn't just beneficiary to Ireland. It is beneficiary on a global scale, because colonial is a global human experience. And if we are the origins and the beginning of that, and if we can overcome that ourselves and decolonise, and that's just awareness. It's not about pointing the finger. It's not anti-English, anti-Protestant, or anti-Dublin, or anti-settled. That's colonial nonsense. This is about a human experience. And then when you marry that with science, such as microbiology, which is then a beneficiary for everybody, not just for travellers. Archaeology, understanding your roots and your history, all that is hugely beneficiary. And it does something. It's like I often say that it's like a psychological medicine. Knowledge is a psychological medicine. It gives you framework, context. It gives you a self-belonging. Travellers have lost that, as has a lot of settled people, in their sense of identity and roots. So I think the beneficiaries are just endless. There's no downside to this where it says this is actually bad for one community or the worst, or another, or it's bad for the nation. That doesn't exist. It's really positive all around.
And just adding to that then, so moving it away from what we've had to date, which is a service-led approach, and we've lost those community development principles that we would have had up to 2008, 2009, combat poverty, all of those agencies abolished. So is there potential to bring momentum behind this type of approach and embed it into a community development approach with the traveller community? And
it goes back to what we keep saying about, say, the multidisciplinary approach. Like when we got linked in with microbiology, that was in itself a game changer. Now, for the first time, we had 21st century science that gives credence to what travellers had been saying all along. Otherwise, without that science, they were just, okay, well, that's nice, but there's no factual proof to that, there's no evidence of that. Now there is. So all the disciplines, linguistics tells us that language goes back to early Christian monastics. Archaeologists tell us to go back, way back into history. All these different disciplines helps create a stronger, healthier understanding of who we are as a people. As I mentioned, I keep saying this, that the terms settled and traveller are colonial labels. In a Gaelic world, they don't exist. They only exist in a paradigm where it was created out of colonisation. So, yeah, I think there's a lot we can do collectively together.
Yeah, I would think that the so-called settled community has lost an awful lot as well. We've gained an awful lot with modernisation, education, with more free time, leisure time, lots of things you could measure, and we are living longer. But we also have acquired more marginalised groups. It's not just the travellers. I would say the elderly. There's more loneliness in settled society, and there's and loneliness and despair is a growing problem. We hear that younger people are living in an age of anxiety. That, I mean, I thought I used to be anxious, but I mean, younger people are very anxious, and it's hard to know what's going on. So there are an awful lot of commonalities. They're not quite as severe as the traveller experience, I have to say, right? But it seems to me there are again lessons from hearing about one ethnic group that are not irrelevant to the settled community.
Yeah, and it does, like, you know, that with that modernisation comes technology-based living and more sedentary lifestyles and all of these other challenges. But you speak about older people, but younger people too are losing a sense of direction. And I think the opportunity to have an understanding of these colonial issues, these broader issues, could be beneficial to all of us. And I think from our work, you know, from the work of this committee, it's been absolutely fascinating afternoon of a conversation. You know, we spent a lot of time here talking about very, very difficult, very heavy issues around health, around welfare, around well-being, around crime, social issues, and today has just been, you know, revelation in terms of a broader understanding.
If I might say so for a moment, is that we have a kind of a built-in clause into our decolonisation, that if you're racist, you're psychologically colonised, because racism comes from colonisation. It was to dehumanise other people. So when we hear people claiming to be native Gaels and indigenous this and indigenous that, but then they're anti-migrant at the same time, that is all the hallmarks of a psychologically colonised person. So if you're racist, you're psychologically colonised, you need support.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree. That's a good way to end it, I think. Thank you so much. I want to thank you all for your time here this afternoon. It's been really, really fascinating conversation and again, thank the members for their contributions. And, you know, again, we will take your statements and incorporate it into our own important work over the next number of months as well. So, again, thank you all for...
Just to say also, we submitted this in 2019.
Okay.
We never got called up anyway.
You got the call up this time.
And we did. And it's interesting because the majority now are Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, which makes it more interesting. So, yeah, it's been a really good experience.
Yeah, and it's a good committee. It's very good committee regardless of party.
I've watched many of your videos and, I've always been impressed.
It is.
So well done.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, and the committee now stands suspended till...
7th.
The 7th.
Oh, today's the 7th.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.